Hey y'all, welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time visiting, my name is Stephanie and I appreciate you stopping by. I know it's been a while since my last video, but I'm back today with a video full of 10 primitive decor DIYs that are perfect to add a touch of Americana to your home. If you haven't already, I would appreciate it if you would hit that subscribe button, and if you enjoy this video, please give it a thumbs up and comment down below with which project is your favorite. Let's go ahead and get started. For this project, I used this large birdhouse that I found at Goodwill and started by cleaning it up and removing the paper on the front and sides. I then used Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster to paint the entire birdhouse with 2 good coats. Once that was dry, I used Waverly chalk paint in the color crimson and a small flat paintbrush to paint some red stripes along the front, sides, and back of the birdhouse. I did not want them to be perfectly straight, so I just freehanded them. Next, I used Waverly chalk paint in the color Ocean to paint the roof of the house with 2 good coats. I printed this primitive star onto some cardstock and cut it out, then placed it on one side of the roof and used a pencil to trace around the outside edges. I also traced the star onto the other side so that there was one on each side of the roof. I then used Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster to paint both of the stars. Once everything was dry, I took some Waverly antique wax and lightly dry brushed the entire birdhouse to give it a more rustic and primitive look. Next, I used apple barrel paint in the color nutmeg brown to paint the opening and the perch with a couple good coats. After that was dry, I took some matte Mod Podge and applied it around the opening of the birdhouse, working in small sections, and then took some cinnamon and sprinkled it on top of the Mod Podge while it was still wet. I continued to repeat this step until I had the entire circle covered with the cinnamon, and then went back over the top with another layer of Mod Podge and more cinnamon, this time tapping off the excess. I did go ahead and cover the little perch with the cinnamon to give it a rusty look as well. Once that was dry, I applied some hot glue on the inside edge of the opening and tucked in a little bit of the brown Spanish moss from the Dollar Tree and trimmed it up, and this one is finished. This little birdhouse turned out so well. I'm very happy with it, and it was extremely quick and easy to make over. Moving right along to project number 2. For this project, I used one of these scrap pieces of wood that is roughly 5.5 inches wide and 11.5 inches long, and started by using Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster to heavily dry brush the front. Once the paint was dry, I took a finger sander and heavily distressed around the edges of the sign as well as the center until I was happy with the way it looked. Next, I took this primitive star that I had printed out onto some cardstock and cut out, and placed it over on the left side of the sign and used a pencil to trace it onto the wood. I then used Waverly chalk paint in the color Ocean to paint the star, giving it 2 good coats. Next, I used Waverly chalk paint in the color Crimson and a small flat paintbrush to paint 3 wavy lines to the right of the star, and again, these lines are not meant to be perfect, so I freehanded them. After all of the paint was dry, I decided it was a little too crisp and not quite primitive enough, so I went back in with the finger sander and distressed the star and the stripes until I was happy with the way it looked, and this one is finished. This one is a super quick project using a piece of scrap wood that I had laying around, and I think it turned out perfect to add to any display. Next up, project number 3. For this project, I used one of these glass sugar shakers from the Dollar Tree and started by removing the label and the lid. I then used Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster to paint the outside of the shaker with a few good coats until it was opaque. To make the Grubby mixture that I'm using for this project, I mixed a jar of ground cinnamon into a medium plastic bowl with a lid, along with a small jar of ground cloves, a small jar of ground nutmeg, a small jar of pumpkin pie spice, and a small jar of instant coffee, and mixed them all together until it looked like a bowl of dried dirt. I then took some matte Mod Podge and, working in small sections, applied it generously to the outside of the shaker and spooned the grubby mixture on top while it was still wet and tapped off the excess. I continued to repeat this process until I had the entire outside of the shaker pretty much covered with the mixture. After letting the shaker dry, I went back in with some more matte Mod Podge and stippled it on the outside to seal everything in place and to give it a wet, muddy look, and set it aside to completely dry. This is how it turned out when it was dry. Next, I created this primitive flag with the word Liberty stamped onto it and printed it out onto some cardstock and cut it out. I will leave a link to this free printable in the description box below for y'all. Once I had the tag cut out, I wasn't happy with the white edges, so I took a black Sharpie and went along the edges. I then took a hole punch and punched a hole in the upper left corner of the tag. I then placed the tag on some jute twine from Walmart and tied it tightly around the lid of the shaker right under where the lid screws on. Next, I took a small styrofoam ball from the Dollar Tree that fit perfectly down inside the shaker and pushed it through the top. To create the floral arrangement, I used a few of these white German statice, blue daisies, and red baby's breath, all from the Dollar Tree, and arranged them in the shaker until I was happy with the way it looked. I wanted to cover up the visible stems, so I took some Spanish moss from the Dollar Tree and placed it down inside the shaker to cover them. Then, to finish up this project, I took this small American flag that I picked up in this multi-pack from a thrift store and placed it in the arrangement off to the right side, and this one is finished. Y'all, this one turned out super cute, and the grubby mixture smells amazing. Moving on to project number 4. For this project, I used this set of 3 paper mache stacking boxes from this multi-pack that I picked up on sale at Hobby Lobby. I started with the smallest box and used Waverly chalk paint in the color crimson to give it a couple good coats. Once the paint was dry, I took a finger sander and distressed around the edges of the lid and the bottom of the box to give it a worn look. I then traced out 1776 and some primitive stars onto some printer paper and shaded in the back with a pencil. I will have a link to this printable down below. I decided which side of the box I wanted the 1776 on and used some tape to hold it in place while I traced over the stars and the numbers with a sharp tip pen to transfer it to the side of the box. I then used apple barrel paint in the color light mocha and a detailed paintbrush to fill in the numbers and the stars. Once the paint was dry, I used Waverly Antique Wax and heavily dry brushed the entire box, including the lid, to give it an aged and rustic look. Moving on to the medium box, I used Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster and gave the whole box a couple good coats. I had some of these vinyl stars left over from a previous project, and I placed them around the edge of the lid, spacing them out as evenly as possible without getting too technical. I then used Waverly chalk paint in the color Ocean and gave the lid a couple good coats and set it aside to completely dry. Once the paint was dry, I carefully removed the stars using a pair of tweezers until I had them all removed. Next, I used Waverly chalk paint in the color Crimson and a medium-sized flat paintbrush to paint 3 lines around the box, again not worrying about them being perfect since this is meant to be imperfect. To finish up this box, I used Waverly Antique Wax and heavily dry brushed the whole box, including the lid. For the large box, I used Waverly chalk paint in the color Ocean to paint the entire box with 2 good coats. Next, I traced off this Olde Glory with a primitive star onto some printer paper and shaded in the back with a pencil, then transferred it onto the front of the box like I did with the small box. Again, I will link all of these printables in the description box. I used apple barrel paint in the color light mocha and a detail brush to paint the words and the star. Then, to finish up this box, I once again heavily dry brushed it with the Waverly Antique Wax, and this whole project is finished. I absolutely love how these stacking boxes turned out, and they were so much fun to make. Let's move on to project number 5. For this project, I used these 3 hardcover books that I picked up at a thrift store and started by removing the paper covers from the front of each book. I then used Waverly chalk paint in the color ink to paint the front and back cover of all 3 books, making sure to get all of the visible edges. Once the paint was completely dry, I took some matte Mod Podge and applied a generous layer to the front of one of the books, and while it was still wet, I took some Waverly chalk paint in the color sandstone and used a wide brush, applied a layer on top of the Mod Podge, making sure to only go over each section one time. I then took the heat tool and used it to dry the Mod Podge and the sandstone to create a crackling effect. I also went ahead and repeated this process on the back cover and the spine so that it had a single cohesive look. After all of the paint was dry, I took a piece of sandpaper and went over the edges as well as the front and back of the book to give it a more distressed and old look until I was happy with it. Next, I sketched out this image of some primitive firecrackers and the word Liberty onto some cardstock and shaded in the back with a pencil. This will be in the description box with the printables for y'all as well. I placed the image on the front cover and used a few pieces of tape to hold it in place while I traced the image onto the book using a sharp pointed pen. To paint the image, I used Waverly chalk paints in the colors crimson, ocean, plaster, and ink. Once the paint was completely dry, I took some Waverly antique wax and heavily dry brushed the entire book. For the other 2 books, I repeated the process to crackle the sandstone paint and then sketched out these 2 additional images, which will be in the description box as printables as well, and used the pencil shading method to transfer them onto the other 2 books. To finish the other books, I used folk art enamel paint in the color gold ore, Waverly chalk paints in the colors ocean, plaster, crimson, antique wax, ink, and sandstone. Here is the other 2 books when they were completely finished, and I could not be happier with the way this set turned out. It did take a little time to paint these books, but it was absolutely worth it. I'm one of those crafters that really enjoy detailed painting, so this was a really relaxing project for me. On to project number 6. For this project, I used one of these larger picture frames from the Dollar Tree and started by removing the backing and the jute twine. I then used Waverly chalk paint in the color ocean to paint the frame with a couple good coats. Once the paint was dry, I took a finger sander and went around the edges of the frame to give it a distressed look. Next, I took this natural burlap ribbon from Walmart and placed the backing of the frame down onto the burlap and traced around the edges with a black Sharpie and cut it out. I then took some matte Mod Podge and applied an even layer to the backing of the frame and set it aside to fully dry. After it was dry, I placed the piece of burlap on top of the backing and placed a piece of parchment paper on top and used my mini heat press to reactivate the Mod Podge and adhere it to the back of the frame. I then took some scissors and cut off the excess burlap hanging over the edges. Next, I taped off the upper left corner of the burlap and used Waverly chalk paint in the color ocean to paint a square. Once that was dry, I went ahead and taped off the blue square and the stripes of the flag, not being too worried about them being perfect. I then used Waverly chalk paint in the color crimson to paint the exposed stripes and remove the tape. After that was dry, I used Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster and heavily dry brushed over the remaining stripes and set it aside to dry. I replaced the backing back into the frame, making sure the jute hanger was still attached at the top and that all of the tabs were secure. I used this metal star from this ornament set from the Dollar Tree and cut the star along with the metal hoop from the ornament. I then used apple barrel paint in the color nutmeg brown and gave the front of the star a few good coats. Once that was dry, I applied some matte Mod Podge to the front of the star, working in sections, and while it was still wet, put some cinnamon over the top and tapped off the excess until I had the whole front of the star covered. When it was completely covered, I went back over the top of the cinnamon with a stippling motion and more Mod Podge to seal it in place and to give it an old rusted metal look. I did want a little bit more of the rusted metal looking a little more flaky, so once I had the final coat of Mod Podge in place, I lightly sprinkled more cinnamon on top and tapped off the excess. After the star was dry, I used some Gorilla Glue super glue to attach the star to the center of the blue square on the flag, and this one is finished. This may be my favorite from today's video. I love how simple it is, but it makes a statement on any vignette. Let's jump into project number 7. For this project, I used one of these long but small wooden cutting boards from this multi-pack that I got on Temu some time ago, and started by using Waverly chalk paint in the color ink to paint the entire thing with 2 good coats. Next, I took a finger sander and heavily distressed around all of the edges. I then took 2 of these tumbling tower blocks from the Dollar Tree and used Waverly chalk paint in the color ink to paint them. I did go ahead and distress the edges of them as well. Next, I took 2 of these spent shell casings that I had in my stash and used Gorilla Glue super glue to attach the 2 of them together, stacking them so that the opening of one of the shells pointed upwards. Once the glue had set up, I used Waverly chalk paint in the color ink to paint them. After everything was completely dry, I used more of the Gorilla Glue super glue to attach the shell casings in the center of the cutting board near the bottom and set it aside to dry. I then used some hot glue to attach the 2 tumbling tower blocks together, stacking one on top of the other, and then used more hot glue to attach the block stack to the back of the cutting board at the bottom in the center so that it would stand on its own. Then, to finish up this project, I took another one of these mini American flags from this pack that I got at the thrift store, and because the flag was quite wrinkled, I used the heat tool to iron out some of the kinks. The flagpole was a bit too long, so I went ahead and cut it down to size and placed it down inside the shell casings, and this one is finished. I love how simple this turned out, and it was super quick and easy to make, and it's small enough to fit into any tiered tray, vignette, or space. Moving right along to project number 8. For this project, I used one of these chunky wooden hearts from the Dollar Tree and used some wood filler to fill in the hole at the top. After the wood filler was dry, I sanded it down so that it was nice and smooth, then used Waverly Antique Wax to stain the entire heart. Once that was dry, I taped off the top portion of the heart and used Waverly chalk paint in the color Ocean to give it one light coat and set it aside to dry. Next, I used a stencil from the Dollar Tree along with some Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster and placed the part of the stencil I wanted down onto the blue section of the heart, and using a small stencil brush stippled on a mixture of larger and smaller stars with the plaster paint and set it aside to dry. When that was dry, I taped off the blue section of the heart as well as 3 stripes, again not being concerned if they were even or if they were even straight. I then took Waverly chalk paint in the color Crimson and gave them one thin coat. Next, I used Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster to paint the remaining stripes with one light coat. I then took Waverly chalk paint in the color Ink and a fine paintbrush and carefully made squiggle lines to separate each of the stripes and the blue section of the heart, as well as around the edges. After that was dry, I took some more antique wax and heavily dry brushed the front of the heart. I took a small drill bit and carefully drilled a hole on each side of the heart at the top, making sure to go all the way through the wood. To create a hanger, I took some silver wire and fed it through the back side of one of the holes, leaving excess on the front side of the heart, and took a small dowel rod and twisted the excess wire around it to create a spring-like spiral to secure it in place. I then used some pliers as needed to smush the spiral together. I then repeated this step to attach the other side of the hanger. Then, to finish up this project, I took a scrap strip of this red and tan homespun fabric that I had in my stash and some of this raffia and tied it in a knot at the top of the hanger, then trimmed up the ends, and this one is finished. I do love how this one turned out. It's a small piece that can really be placed just about anywhere, including on a tiered tray. On to project number 9. For this project, I used one of these wooden rooster cutouts from Walmart and started by using Waverly Antique Wax to stain the entire rooster. To save a bit of time here, I used Waverly chalk paints in the colors Crimson, Plaster, Ink, and Ocean, along with apple barrel paint in the color Golden Sunset to paint the rooster like this. Next, I took a scrap piece of this blue fabric with little white stars that I had in my stash and cut it out roughly the same size as the rooster's little 3D wing. I then took some matte Mod Podge and applied a generous layer to the wing and set it aside to fully dry. Once it was dry, I placed the fabric onto the wing, followed by a sheet of parchment paper, and used my mini heat press to reactivate the Mod Podge and adhere the fabric to the wing. After the fabric was attached, I took a small pair of detailed scissors and trimmed off the excess fabric. Next, I took one of these 1/4-inch dowel rods from this multi-pack that I got at Walmart and cut it down to 5.5 inches long. For the base, I used this 5-inch piece of scrap wood that I had in my stash. I used Waverly Antique Wax to stain both the dowel and the wooden base. Once those pieces were dry, I took a 1/4-inch drill bit and drilled a hole in the middle of the wooden base a little over halfway through the thickness of the wood. I then filled the hole up with hot glue and placed the dowel rod into the hole to secure it in place. Next, I applied some hot glue to the top of the dowel rod and put the rooster in place and held it there until the glue set up. Then I took one of these small brown paper tags from this pack that I picked up on sale at Hobby Lobby and used these stamps to spell out USA in lowercase letters using this stamp set from the Dollar Tree. I used black permanent ink to stamp the letters onto the center of the tag and then took this star stencil from the Dollar Tree and used a pencil to trace out a star on the upper right corner and one on the lower right corner of the tag. I then used Waverly chalk paints in the colors Crimson and Ocean to paint the 2 stars. Once that was dry, I fed a piece of jute through the hole on the tag, creating a large head knot to secure it in place. I took some scrap red and tan homespun fabric and some raffia and used them to create this simple shoestring bow. I tied a knot in the jute on the tag so that it would hang at the length that I wanted and cut off the excess, and used hot glue to attach it to the back of the bow off to the right side a little. Then, to finish up this project, I used hot glue to attach the bow and the tag to the dowel rod right underneath the rooster's feet. I think this turned out adorable and would be perfect to add a little Americana flair to a farmhouse kitchen. And last but not least, project number 10. For this super quick project, I used 3 of these vintage textile bobbins that I picked up at a local flea market. I started with the largest bobbin and wrapped the stem of it with some of this 4-ply jute cord from Walmart, using hot glue as needed, but trying to keep it off of the bobbin itself. I then took some Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster and heavily dry brushed over the jute, keeping it off of the wood. After dry brushing, it caused a lot of jute fuzzies, as I call them, so I took a lighter and carefully burnt them off and singed the jute to give it a more rustic look. For the next bobbin, I used a strip of this red and tan homespun fabric from Hobby Lobby, and again used hot glue to wrap it around the stem of the bobbin, using just enough hot glue on the wood to hold it in place and cut off the excess. Finally, for the last bobbin, I used a strip of this blue fabric with white stars from Hobby Lobby and used hot glue to wrap it around the wooden stem, using a dab of hot glue on the fabric to secure the other end in place, and trimmed off the excess, and this project is done. This project was super quick and super easy, but these make fantastic filler pieces for dough bowls or displays that need a little something extra. And that's it for today's video, y'all. I know this is a couple more projects than I usually put into my videos, but I got started creating and the ideas just kept flowing. I finally had to make myself stop. This isn't usually a style that I usually create or decorate in, but I really did enjoy it. So if you'd like to see more primitive crafts for the upcoming holidays and seasons, let me know in the comments below, because I would love an excuse to do more. Also, let me know which one of these 10 projects is your favorite today. I love them all, so it's really hard for me to just say one. Please remember to like this video if you enjoyed it, and share with a friend if you think they may like the content. It really does help me out here on YouTube. Also, if you haven't subscribed already, what are you waiting for? Click that button and stick around for a little while. I have tons of fun projects on the way. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.